Let's establish one thing with absolute certainty. Medieval castles were not merely cold, they were frigid. This wasn't a grab an extra blanket kind of cold, but the profound, biting cold where you could see the ghost of your own breath hanging in the air indoors. These were colossal stone boxes, engineered to withstand protracted sieges, not to provide comfort for their guests. There was no concept of central heating, no network of radiators, and certainly no warm, high-tog duvets filled with goose feathers and thermal sheets. So, how was it accomplished? How did the people living within these drafty, freezing fortresses manage to sleep through the night without being transformed into human icicles? Today, we are not just looking at the past. We are stepping into its shadows, into the very chill of a forgotten world, to find out how medieval people didn't just endure the cold. They fought a nightly war against it, and they made it through, barely. When we picture medieval castles, our minds often drift to romantic images. The warm, flickering glow of candlelight dancing across rich tapestries, magnificent banquets held in great halls, and nobles lounging in opulent, fur-lined robes. But the reality, for most, was a brutally uncomfortable existence at night, especially during the punishing depths of winter. Behind those thick, formidable stone walls was a world that felt colder than many winter forests. There was no insulation, no double glazing. There was only raw stone, vast open quarters, and a biting wind that whistled through every crack and crevice like a whispered warning. Sleeping in a castle wasn't romantic. It was a nightly struggle, and surviving the cold was every bit as important as surviving your enemies. Let's begin with the fundamental problem: the stone itself. Castles were made of it for a very good reason. Stone is fireproof. It is incredibly durable. It stands strong against a volley of arrows and the crushing force of battering rams. But for all its defensive qualities, it is also a terrible insulator. Unlike wood or even mud brick, stone absorbs the cold like a sponge, and once chilled, it holds that cold, radiating it for hours, sometimes for days on end. Even if you managed to light a fire in a room, the heat would vanish the moment the flames died down, as if the stone itself was swallowing it whole. Now, build this picture in your mind. Thick stone walls, some reaching an astonishing 10 feet deep, surrounding you on all sides. A high, cavernous ceiling far above your head, and small, narrow windows, if any existed at all. There were no carpets to soften the footfalls, no insulation hidden within the walls, just unforgiving slabs of rock echoing your every step, relentlessly radiating the deep, permeating chill of the earth itself. And the very layout of the castle conspired against warmth. Great halls were massive, open spaces, impossible to heat effectively. Bedchambers were often perched in towers, high above the ground, where the winds blew strongest and most fiercely. Those iconic spiral staircases, a marvel of engineering, yes, but they also acted like wind tunnels, channeling drafts through the entire structure. The only thing standing between you and a midnight breeze were heavy wooden doors, and, if you were wealthy enough to afford them, thick woven tapestries. In short, castles were masterfully designed to keep enemies out, but they were never intended to keep the heat in. And it wasn't just the stone. The design itself was a conduit for the cold. Most rooms weren't hermetically sealed. They were part of a sprawling network of chambers and hallways that allowed drafts to sneak in from every conceivable direction. Open courtyards in the center of the complex acted as funnels, letting the wind swirl into the very heart of the castle. So at night, when the sun finally set and the fires dimmed to glowing embers, the cold became a silent invader, unseen, unstoppable, and absolutely everywhere. In most medieval castles, the closest thing to what we would call heating was an open hearth. This was, if you were lucky, a large stone fireplace. If you were not, It was simply a small, designated fire pit in the center of the room. These fireplaces were notoriously inefficient. They struggled to warm even the immediate space directly around them, let alone an entire room with 20-foot ceilings. They filled the air with a thick, acrid smoke that stung the eyes and coated every surface with a layer of soot. To make matters worse, before the 12th century, there were no chimneys. Smoke was simply expected to drift upwards, hoping to escape through designated holes in the wall or ceiling. Most of it didn't. So, what did they do? They relied on smaller, more personal bedroom fires, called chamber hearths. But these were a luxury only the wealthy could afford. Servants and the lower-ranking members of the household often slept in cold, entirely unheated side rooms, or even in hallways and alcoves, without any fire at all. For those with the means, they used braziers, ornate metal bowls, filled with glowing hot coals. These portable heaters could warm a room slightly, but they came with significant danger. Hot coals in a room built primarily of wood, with straw on the floor and in the mattress. You see the problem. Fires were common. So were severe burns. And then there was the silent killer, the smoke. More than one person in medieval history died, not from freezing, but from carbon monoxide inhalation in a poorly ventilated room. Still, the brazier glowed, the fire cracked, and for a brief, precious moment, warmth returned enough to take off your boots and pray for morning. Now, we get to the real medieval survival weapon, a masterpiece of practical design. The bed with curtains. These were not just fancy, ostentatious pieces of royal furniture. The four-poster bed, with its heavy enveloping drapes, existed for one primary reason: to keep warmth in. Imagine creating a tent inside a stone room, a small sanctuary wrapped in layers of thick, insulating fabric. That's precisely what these beds were. These curtains weren't for decoration, they were for survival. At night, you would pull them shut, sealing yourself off from the rest of the freezing room. The warmth of your own body, and perhaps the bodies of one or two others, was trapped inside this cocoon of cloth. But it gets even better. Wealthier families would line their bed curtains with wool or even fur. Some even used heavy felted wool blankets, as thick as rugs, as an extra layer of insulation. The bed frame itself was raised, sometimes several feet off the frigid floor, to escape the cold drafts that snaked across the stone floor. And the mattress? A simple sack filled with straw, or for the more fortunate, feathers. It was not exactly memory foam, but it held warmth effectively. And most importantly, in a world of damp and chill, it stayed dry. Families often doubled up. It was common for 2, 3, even 4 people to share one bed. Children slept with their siblings. Servants slept with other servants. Warmth was far more important than any modern notion of personal space. You didn't sleep spread out in luxurious abandon. You curled up tight, knees tucked into your chest, arms wrapped around yourself. It wasn't about comfort, it was about containment. And once you were in, you didn't get out until daylight. Let's be clear, enduring a castle night wasn't something you did by yourself, especially not if you were nobility. For this, you must enter the servants, specifically the night servants. These dedicated men and women had one singular goal: to make sure their master didn't freeze. Imagine being one of them, a young woman named Elspeth. Your memory of winter is not of snow, but of the weight of hot stones in your arms, their heat searing through the cloth. You remember the perpetual ache in your back from carrying coals up the spiral stairs, and the fear in your heart as you dozed in a chair, listening for the slightest stir from your lord, knowing his warmth was your sole responsibility. Their methods were both clever and utterly exhausting. First, They prepared the bedchamber. Hours before bedtime, a servant would light a fire. They would warm bedstones and tuck them deep into the mattress. They would boil water, pouring it into metal bottles or sturdy ceramic jars, which were then wrapped tightly in cloth and slid under the covers like primitive hot water bottles. Next, the blankets. Thick wool, sometimes heavy fur, always layered meticulously. And then they stayed. They remained in the room all night, listening, to replenish the brazier, to add logs to the fire, to provide another blanket. Their job didn't end when their master fell asleep. In many ways, that's when it truly began. The comfort of one person was often built on the sleepless labor of 3 or 4 others. You might think that nobles had it better when it came to sleeping warm, and in some ways they did. But here's the twist. Noble bedchambers were strategically located in the upper floors of towers more exposed to the relentless wind, and often built with large, unglazed windows. So while lords and ladies had help, the cold still reached them, sometimes with more ferocity than it reached the poor sleeping below. Servants often slept near the great kitchen hearth, in basements, or in inner quarters. Some even curled up beside livestock in the castle stables, because body heat, whether from a cow or a cousin, was better than none. The warmth-to-status equation wasn't linear. In castles, warmth came from location, not from luxury. Maybe you've felt a real cold before, the kind that makes your fingers numb. But have you ever felt a cold that seeps through stone walls and settles in your bones for months on end? This was a different kind of cold, a presence that never left. Now, let's talk about the real survivors, the people who didn't even get to lie down, the night guards, the watchmen. These weren't soldiers in gleaming armor. They were often young, poorly fed, and wrapped in mismatched layers of rough wool. Their job was threefold. Do not fall asleep, do not freeze, do not die. Imagine standing on that battlement, the wind a physical force trying to push you from the wall. Your world is reduced to the stamping of your own frozen feet on the stone and the rhythmic chattering of your teeth. You chew on a dried clove, its sharp taste a small shock to keep you awake. You are not just fighting the cold, you are fighting the sleep that the cold promises, a sleep from which you know you might never wake up. They survived through constant motion. They stamped their feet, swung their arms, huddled near each other like birds on a branch. Sometimes they rotated shifts every 2 hours. Sometimes they didn't. Many guards simply wrapped hot stones in cloth and tucked them under their cloaks. Others carried flasks of spiced wine or ale, not to get drunk, but to keep the blood moving. Alcohol didn't actually warm them, but it made them forget how cold they truly were. For them, the cold wasn't just a discomfort. It was a test, one you couldn't afford to fail, because if you fell asleep and an enemy entered, everyone paid the price. So, how did people sleep in medieval castles without freezing to death? The answer is, barely. They didn't sleep in comfort. They slept in layers, in groups, in silence, in dread of the cold winds that came down from tower staircases like ghosts. They built fires that smoked, carried rocks that burned, and pulled curtains that barely blocked the chill. They relied on servants to bring them heat, on animals to share their warmth, and on each other to endure. And still, some didn't make it. Winter deaths were common. Fevers turned fatal. Infirmity meant exposure, and exposure in a medieval castle was often a death sentence. But they endured, because that's what humans do. They adapt. They wrap themselves in everything they can find: wool, ash, ritual, tradition. And they pass those survival tricks down from generation to generation, one cold night at a time. So the next time you pull a blanket over your shoulders or turn up the thermostat, remember that somewhere in the past, Someone was trying to sleep on stone, with smoke in their lungs and frost in their breath. And they made it, not because they were warm, but because they were determined. And sometimes, that was all that mattered.